When you picture the 19th century, you might imagine gas lamps flickering along cobbled streets, trains cutting across the countryside, and chimneys pushing smoke into the sky. The Victorian age was often described as an age of progress, of invention, and of ceaseless activity. But what happened when the sun went down and people retreated indoors? For many, sleep did not come as easily as they hoped. Victorian Britain is remembered for its busy factories and bustling cities, but less often for its quieter struggle with sleeplessness. As urban life expanded, so too did complaints of nervous disorders and wakeful nights. Physicians began to notice patients who could not drift into rest. Newspapers offered columns on remedies for the sleepless. Even ordinary household diaries recorded the frustrations of lying awake through the hours when all seemed silent outside. The Victorians did not invent insomnia, of course. People in earlier centuries also faced restless nights. But in this period, sleeplessness became a cultural subject, a problem to be measured, discussed, and treated. The age that prided itself on productivity also began to worry about the hours lost to wakefulness. Let us imagine an ordinary Victorian household preparing for bed. Candles or oil lamps were gradually replaced by gaslight, especially in larger towns. Curtains were drawn against the soot-filled air, and families retired to bedrooms where the temperature was rarely consistent. Sometimes cold enough to require layers of blankets, other times stuffy from coal fires. Clocks ticked in every home. With railways running on strict timetables, the sense of measured time grew sharper. A worker in Manchester or London might return home at a fixed hour, eat supper, read the newspaper, and expect to sleep before another day began. The rhythm of life was increasingly regularized, leaving less room for flexible patterns of rest. Bedrooms themselves reflected social ideals. For the middle class, sleeping quarters were carefully arranged, with iron bedsteads replacing wooden frames to guard against infestations. Mattresses might be filled with horsehair, feathers, or new manufactured springs. Sheets were laundered regularly, part of the Victorian concern for cleanliness. Even the arrangement of pillows was subject to advice from household manuals. Yet in spite of these efforts, sleep often failed. Complaints poured in of tossing and turning, of an overactive mind, or of sudden night terrors. In medical texts of the time, the word insomnia appeared with greater frequency. Doctors described it as a nervous complaint, a symptom rather than a disease. It was associated with neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis for modern fatigue and with overwork of the brain. Medical journals discussed varieties of sleeplessness. Some patients struggled to fall asleep at all. Others woke repeatedly. Still others awoke too early, unable to return to slumber. The terminology was fluid, but the recognition of a shared problem was clear. One physician wrote that insomnia was a most distressing malady, undermining strength and wasting the frame. Another noted that businessmen were especially prone, their minds occupied with calculations, letters, and appointments. Women, too, were reported to suffer, often linked, sometimes unfairly, by doctors to hysteria or delicate nerves. Even the idea of nerves itself took on special importance. To be nervous was not merely to feel anxious, but to possess a finely tuned constitution that reacted strongly to modern life. Insomnia, therefore, was framed as a condition of sensitive individuals trying to endure the pressures of a rapidly changing society. Why did sleeplessness become so prominent in the Victorian imagination? Part of the answer lies in the transformation of work and leisure. Factories demanded long hours, often from early morning until late at night. Urban environments were noisy, with carts clattering on stones, trains passing at all hours, and gas lamps burning long into the evening. Even when homes were quiet, the stimulation of reading, correspondence, and conversation often carried minds past midnight. The press also played a role. Articles about how to sleep circulated in popular magazines. Advice was sometimes contradictory. One column recommended a warm glass of milk before bed. Another insisted on cold baths. The sheer abundance of guidance may have reinforced the sense that sleeplessness was a common plight. Religious thought added its own dimension. Some preachers warned against lying awake with sinful worries, encouraging prayer during restless hours. Others interpreted insomnia as a test of faith, a reminder that earthly discomfort prepared the soul for eternal rest. Despite the growing talk of insomnia, most people followed simple routines to invite sleep. Herbal teas, such as chamomile or valerian, were common. Gentle exercise before bed was sometimes suggested, though not to the point of exertion. Reading religious texts or dull volumes of history was thought to quiet the mind. Working families often went to bed out of sheer exhaustion, though their sleep might be interrupted by crowded living conditions. In urban tenements, several people shared a room, with little chance for uninterrupted rest. Country households, by contrast, often retired earlier, their days still shaped by natural light rather than factory whistles. Children were usually put to bed at fixed hours, with strict discipline to prevent wandering after dark. Nurses and governesses followed routines of storytelling, prayer, and careful tucking in. The concern for children's sleep reflected broader Victorian anxieties about health and moral development. At the same time, physicians and natural philosophers began to wonder about the mechanics of slumber. Sleep was not yet studied with brainwave machines or laboratory tests, but it was observed closely in daily life. Medical journals reported experiments with diet, posture, and room ventilation. Could sleeplessness be caused by indigestion, by poor air circulation, by an excess of thought? Each theory gave rise to new recommendations. Pharmacists also advertised mixtures intended to calm the nerves. Patent medicines, sold over the counter, claimed to soothe restlessness. Some contained alcohol, others relied on opiates. Still others combined herbs and syrups. Their precise formulas were often kept secret, but their promise was clear: a sure and gentle sleep. Interestingly, not all Victorians regarded insomnia as purely negative. For some, wakefulness was a sign of refinement. Intellectuals who read late into the night, or poets who composed verses under the lamp, sometimes described their sleeplessness as part of their vocation. To be awake when others slept was to dwell in a special world of thought. Yet this romantic image sat uneasily beside the medical warnings. Too little rest, doctors insisted, weakened the body, shortened life, and left the mind unfit for work. Thus, insomnia occupied an ambiguous place, at once a badge of sensitivity and a cause of decline. By the end of the 19th century, insomnia had not been solved, but it had been firmly named. The Victorians catalogued it, worried over it, and sought remedies in every corner of domestic and medical practice. When we imagine their bedrooms, the ticking clocks, the flickering lamps, the heavy curtains, we might picture men and women lying awake, minds full of calculations or concerns, seeking rest that would not come. Their struggle was both ordinary and emblematic of an age. And so this first chapter closes with an open thought. If the Victorians turned their sleeplessness into a subject of study and remedy, what kinds of experiments did they pursue in their search for rest? If Section 1 gave us the background, the ticking clocks, the crowded rooms, the anxious minds of a society in motion, then Section 2 leads us further into the world of remedies. The Victorians were rarely content to accept sleeplessness as fate. They tried to cure it with discipline, with medicine, with contraptions, and with advice. Some remedies sound familiar to us. Others are peculiar, almost quaint. Together they reveal a society both curious and uneasy about the mysteries of sleep. Victorian culture overflowed with advice literature. From cooking to etiquette to health, manuals offered guidance on every aspect of daily life. Sleeplessness was no exception. One widely circulated suggestion was to keep a bedroom well ventilated. The belief was that stale air or vitiated atmosphere caused wakefulness. Advice manuals recommended opening windows slightly, even in winter, to allow a current of fresh air. Heavy curtains, while stylish, were sometimes blamed for blocking circulation. Dietary guidance was equally common. Doctors warned against heavy suppers, especially meats, cheeses, or alcohol taken too late. A light meal of bread and milk was thought to encourage rest. Others suggested avoidance of tea and coffee in the evening, though for many Victorians, these drinks had become indispensable, and the advice was not always heeded. Sleep posture also drew attention. Some manuals insisted that lying on the right side promoted digestion and therefore sleep. Others argued for lying flat on the back with arms gently folded as the most natural position. One could even find diagrams of proper sleeping attitudes in health guides. For those still wakeful, distraction was sometimes recommended. Counting backwards, reciting verses, or imagining tranquil scenes could redirect the mind. These methods sound familiar to us today, a reminder that some sleep strategies change very little across time. Beyond advice, the Victorians placed great trust in patent medicines. The late 19th century saw a flood of bottled syrups, powders, and pills advertised with bold claims. Many of these sleep remedies contained opiates, particularly laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol. Laudanum was widely available, used for everything from coughs to stomach pains, and it found its way into countless soothing syrups. For the sleepless, a few drops might bring heavy rest. But dependence and health risks were not well understood, and critics warned of its dangers. Chloral hydrate, introduced in the 1860s, became another widely used sedative. It was praised for its ability to induce sleep without the unpleasant dreams sometimes associated with opium. Doctors prescribed it, and pharmacies sold it under various names. Yet it too carried risks of dependency and side effects. Even less powerful concoctions were advertised. Mixtures of hops, valerian root, or passion flower promised gentle slumber. Some syrups relied on alcohol alone, marketed as tonics. Advertisements filled newspapers with phrases like, "A restful night restored," or "No more tossing in bed." The sheer number of options may have given comfort, even if their effectiveness varied. To hold a bottle with instructions, to follow a ritual, was itself a way of addressing anxiety. Victorian ingenuity extended beyond medicines. Some inventors sought to design mechanical aids for sleep. One curious example was the sleeping chair, a reclining seat designed to keep the body at a gentle angle, thought to relieve pressure on the stomach and lungs. Similar contraptions included adjustable bedsteads, which could raise or lower sections of the mattress. Weighted blankets also appeared in various forms, though not under that name. Quilts and coverlets were sometimes deliberately heavy, with the belief that pressure calmed the nervous system. Pillows were another field of experiment. Orthopedic cushions promised alignment of the neck and back. Some were filled with herbs such as lavender or hops, releasing a calming fragrance. Inventors even proposed sound machines, though in far simpler form than modern devices. Small water features, placed indoors, could provide a gentle trickle, meant to lull the senses. Others recommended a ticking clock left within earshot, its steady rhythm serving as a natural metronome for the restless mind. The Victorian love of regimens meant that bodily discipline was often prescribed as a cure. For some, the solution lay in cold water. Physicians of the hydropathy movement recommended cold baths, wet sheets, or even a splash of cold water on the face before bed. The shock, they claimed, restored balance to the system. Others preferred warmth. A glass of hot milk, sometimes mixed with nutmeg or cinnamon, was a common household remedy. Warm baths too were praised for their relaxing effect, though not too hot, lest they overexcite the circulation. Exercise was debated. Some doctors believed a long walk before bed was ideal. Others cautioned against exertion in the evening, which could overheat the blood. The advice varied, but the principle remained. Sleep was to be earned through moderation. not indulgence. Not all cures were physical. Many Victorians believed insomnia had a moral or spiritual dimension. Sermons and devotional manuals encouraged prayer during wakeful hours. Rather than resist sleeplessness, one might use it as an opportunity for reflection. Self-help literature suggested mental exercises, repeating phrases, focusing on a single image, or deliberately slowing the breath. Some even recommended memorizing long passages of poetry or scripture, not for study, but for the steady rhythm of recitation. Hypnosis, too, entered the discussion. In the late 19th century, mesmerism and hypnotic suggestion fascinated both doctors and lay people. Practitioners claimed they could induce restful sleep through passes of the hand or through gentle, repetitive speech. While controversial, hypnosis pointed toward a modern understanding of the mind's role in sleeplessness. By the 1880s and 1890s, insomnia had become not just a medical problem but a market. Publishers issued entire volumes on the management of sleeplessness. Articles filled household magazines. Pharmacies promoted their latest sedatives with carefully worded assurances. Middle-class households, especially, consumed this literature eagerly. To sleep poorly was not only uncomfortable, it suggested one was not managing life correctly. In an era when self-discipline and productivity were celebrated, a restless night could feel like a personal failing. Remedies, therefore, offered both physical relief and social reassurance. Taken together, these practices reveal a culture willing to experiment endlessly in pursuit of rest. A Victorian household might try airing out the bedroom one week, purchasing a new patent medicine the next, and investing in a curious pillow the week after. Some methods worked occasionally, others not at all, but the persistence itself is telling. For the Victorians, sleeplessness was not a private quirk, but part of a larger cultural conversation. To be modern was to manage one's health with care, to test new inventions, and to seek solutions in an expanding marketplace of advice. And yet, despite so many efforts, sleeplessness persisted. The bottles on the nightstand, the carefully folded blankets, the memorized verses, all these might soothe for a time, but few offered lasting relief. As one physician sighed in an 1890s journal, of all complaints, there is none so obstinate, none so unyielding, as the simple want of sleep. Which leaves us with a lingering question. If the Victorians filled their homes with remedies and devices, how did they ultimately come to understand insomnia? Not merely as a problem of the body, but as a reflection of their age. The Victorians never solved insomnia, but they left us with something almost as enduring, a way of thinking about sleep, their experiments, their bottles of patent medicines, their carefully written advice books. All of these carried forward into later centuries, shaping the way we still approach rest today. To look at their struggles is not merely to smile at quaint remedies. It is to recognize the beginnings of a conversation that continues each night, when we ask ourselves how to fall asleep. During the early 19th century, insomnia was treated less as a distinct illness and more as a symptom of nerves, of overwork, of indigestion. By the end of the century, however, it had acquired a clearer identity. Doctors spoke of it as a condition that might stand alone, something worthy of study in its own right. This shift reflected broader trends in medicine. The Victorians were eager to classify and name. Just as they labeled new species, catalogued minerals, and organized social statistics, so too did they categorize states of health. Insomnia was not new, but it was newly mapped in the growing atlas of medical knowledge. The classification carried consequences. To speak of insomnia was to acknowledge it as common, treatable, and socially significant. It was no longer just a private complaint whispered in bedrooms. It was a matter for doctors' offices, newspapers, and public discussion. If we compare Victorian remedies to modern ones, the similarities are striking. A warm drink before bed, the airing of a room, the avoidance of stimulants. These remain familiar suggestions. Even the weighted blanket has returned, now marketed with scientific language but echoing practices of a century past. Other remedies faded. Laudanum and chloral hydrate, once praised, were eventually restricted due to their risks. Hypnosis lost much of its fashionable glow, though modern therapy has borrowed some of its insights. The herbal pillows and fragrant sachets of the Victorian bedroom now appear in the form of lavender oils or scented candles. The continuity reminds us that sleep remains elusive. Despite advances in medicine, people still count breaths, repeat verses, and seek comfort in small rituals. The Victorians may have lived in a different world, but their struggles remain recognizable. More than the remedies themselves, it is the cultural meaning of insomnia that lingers. For Victorians, sleeplessness reflected the pace of industrial life, the burden of responsibility, and the fragility of health. To be awake at night was to confront the anxieties of modernity, factory schedules, financial worries, and social expectations. In that sense, insomnia was a mirror. It revealed how individuals absorbed the pressures of their time. A businessman lying awake in Manchester, a governess staring at the ceiling in London, a poet writing by lamplight in Edinburgh. Each embodied the restless spirit of an age in transition. Today, insomnia continues to mirror society, now shaped by screens, irregular work hours, and the constant presence of digital communication. The Victorians remind us that sleeplessness is never only personal, it belongs to the rhythms and demands of the wider world. One of the most enduring contributions of the Victorian era lies in the literature of sleep advice. The household manual that suggested opening a window, the newspaper column that recommended warm milk, the physician who published observations on nervous sleeplessness. All these formed part of a genre that persists in endless how to sleep better articles today. We still live amid advice, some of it scientific, much of it anecdotal. Lists of 10 tips for better sleep are the direct descendants of those Victorian handbooks. The tone has changed little. Calm authority, practical suggestions, and the assurance that rest is within reach if one only follows the right rules. That legacy is quietly significant. It shows how cultural habits are not only passed down through objects or laws, but through small pieces of guidance repeated across generations. As we conclude this first story, we might pause to reflect on what it means to see the Victorians through their sleepless nights. We often think of their era as bustling with industry, invention, and confidence. Yet behind that image lies the quieter truth of restlessness. The nights spent awake despite every effort to rest. The Victorians remind us that progress does not always bring peace. The same factories and timetables that transform society also unsettled sleep. The same medical advances that offered new cures also brought new dependencies. Their restless nights were not failures, but part of the complex balance between human needs and social change. When we picture a Victorian bedroom at midnight, the faint glow of a gas lamp, the heavy quilt, the sound of a clock, we see not only the details of a past age, but the continuity of human experience. The search for sleep links us across centuries, as ordinary now as then. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson the Victorians leave us, that sleeplessness is not only a problem to be solved, but a reminder of how deeply we are bound to our times, our surroundings, and our restless thoughts. And so we close this story with a gentle question. What might future generations think of our own remedies, our glowing screens, our sleep apps, and our restless minds at night? When we imagine ancient Rome, we often think of its grand public spaces, the Forum bustling with merchants, the Colosseum filled with spectators, the aqueducts carrying water across the land. Yet much of Roman life took place not under the sun, but after it had set. The rhythms of night shaped the empire in subtle but important ways. The Roman day, regulated by sundials and water clocks, ended with the fading of light. As shadows lengthened, lamps were lit in houses, torches carried through streets, and the city shifted into a quieter, though not silent state. Night was both a time of rest and a period of particular concerns: safety, cleanliness, and order. To explore the Roman night is to step into a different pace of life, where light was scarce and where watchmen, vendors, and ordinary families managed their hours carefully. Romans did not divide time exactly as we do. They spoke of hours, but these were not of fixed length. An hour in summer could be longer than an hour in winter. The day was divided into segments from dawn to dusk, with the night itself portioned into watches, usually 4 of them, each lasting roughly 3 hours. This division mattered, for it determined who was responsible for keeping watch, when soldiers shifted their duties, and how households measured the passing of the night. A Roman might say he rose at the 3rd watch, meaning he had been awake since midnight. Time, in this sense, was measured not only by clocks, but by social tasks. The setting sun marked the transition. Shops closed, courts recessed, and most formal business ceased. Yet for many, life did not end. Theatres sometimes hosted evening performances, baths remained open into twilight, and taverns welcomed drinkers well into the night. Without electricity, light was precious. Oil lamps were the most common household source, made of clay, bronze, or even silver in wealthier homes. These lamps burned olive oil, with a small wick extending from a spout. Their glow was limited, enough to illuminate a small room, but dim compared to modern lighting. Torches and lanterns lit the streets, though these were often carried by individuals rather than provided by the city. Wealthy citizens sometimes hired torchbearers when moving through town at night. Festivals too were occasions for elaborate displays of light, with rows of lamps set out in public squares. For ordinary people, however, night was dark. Streets outside major centres were largely unlit, and many preferred not to travel far after sunset. The home, with its oil lamps and hearth, was the primary refuge against the shadows. The Roman night was not left entirely unguarded. Cities employed watchmen, vigils in Rome itself, who patrolled streets, maintained order, and kept watch for fires. Fire was one of the greatest dangers of the night, as lamps tipped or kitchens smouldered. The vigiles carried buckets, axes, and sometimes horns to sound alarms. These watchmen also deterred theft and disorder, though their reputation varied. Some were respected as protectors, others were mocked as half-effective, prone to corruption or negligence. Still, their presence represented an organized attempt to manage urban nights. Night watches extended to the military. In forts along the frontiers, soldiers took turns on guard duty, each responsible for a few hours before being relieved. To fail in a night watch was considered a serious offense, as danger might come under cover of darkness. Inside Roman homes, night was a quieter but still active period. Families gathered for evening meals, often the day's main feast taken after work. Following supper, people might converse, read by lamplight, or play games. Wealthier households sometimes hosted evening banquets that stretched into the late hours with music, recitations, and long conversations. For the poor, evenings were simpler. A meal of bread, porridge, or vegetables was eaten. Lamps were lit briefly, and families prepared to rest. In crowded insulae, apartment blocks, noise carried easily, and disturbances were common. Tenants often went to bed early, both from fatigue and to save oil. Children were usually put to bed soon after supper, while adults might remain awake for household tasks. Women sometimes spun wool or prepared food for the following day. Men might review accounts or step outside to speak with neighbours. Though often imagined as silent, Roman nights were not always quiet. Dogs barked. Carriages occasionally rolled through streets despite regulations, and taverns produced laughter and songs. Poets complained of neighbours playing flutes late at night, or quarrels spilling into the street. Yet there were also stretches of deep silence, when lamps burned low, and the city seemed asleep. For those awake during these hours, the contrast was striking. the world reduced to shadows, the sound of a distant watchman's call, or the occasional cry of a bird. Roman writers suggest that sleep, as in many pre-modern societies, was often divided. People sometimes rose during the night for short tasks, writing letters, tending fires, or praying to household gods. Some went back to bed afterward. Others remained awake until dawn. Philosophers occasionally reflected on these nocturnal hours. Seneca, for instance, wrote of using night for study, finding the stillness suitable for thought. Pliny the Elder claimed to rise well before dawn to begin his work. Such habits were admired as signs of discipline, though ordinary people likely valued sleep more than stoic wakefulness. As we look at the Roman night, we see a balance between activity and caution. There were lamps and banquets, but also shadows and silence. There were watchmen and regulations, but also thieves and fires. Night belonged both to danger and to domestic life, to the vigilance of guards and the rest of families. The Roman night was not simply a pause in daily life. It was a time with its own rhythms, responsibilities, and routines. Which leaves us with a quiet question. If the Roman night required so much attention, from watchmen, from households, from rulers themselves, what does this reveal about the empire's understanding of order and control after dark? If Section 1 introduced the Roman night as a balance of darkness and order, Section 2 takes us deeper into the spaces where activity continued after sunset. Far from being entirely silent, the empire's evenings were filled with commerce, entertainment, and ritual. Nighttime could be festive, troubling, or sacred, depending on where one stood. Roman marketplaces, or fora, were usually busiest in daylight, but some trade extended into evening hours. Farmers arriving late to the city sometimes sold produce under torchlight. Bakers worked through the night to prepare bread for dawn, their ovens glowing faintly against the darkness. In larger cities, night markets occasionally appeared around festivals. Merchants selling food, lamps, or trinkets lingered after sunset, attracting crowds who enjoyed strolling in the cooler hours. For many Romans, the night offered relief from the heat of day, making evening commerce practical as well as pleasurable. The sight of torches illuminating rows of stalls would have carried both charm and risk. Buyers haggled, children tugged at parents for treats, and beggars hovered at the edges. Yet the shadows provided cover for pickpockets and disputes. Regulations sometimes attempted to limit night trade, but practice often continued regardless. Taverns, or copone, were among the liveliest places at night. Located along roads and in cities, these establishments provided food, wine, and simple lodgings. Their reputation was mixed. Some were cheerful, serving travelers and locals alike, while others were associated with gambling, brawls, and petty crime. Wine flowed freely, often diluted with water or flavored with honey and herbs. Singing and dice games added to the atmosphere. Musicians sometimes performed, their melodies carrying into the street. The clatter of cups, the laughter of drinkers, and the occasional quarrel gave taverns a distinctive soundscape. Roman writers, usually from elite backgrounds, often disdained taverns, portraying them as haunts of the lower classes. Yet for many ordinary people, they were essential spaces of sociability. The night provided time to gather after work, to share stories, and to relax outside the home. The Roman calendar was filled with festivals, some of which extended into the night. The Saturnalia in December, a celebration of reversal and merriment, often saw banquets and games continuing after dark. Lamps and torches lit streets as revelers exchanged gifts and enjoyed temporary freedoms. Other festivals carried a more sacred character. The Lemuria, held in May, involved nighttime rituals to appease restless spirits of the dead. Householders walked barefoot through their homes at midnight, casting black beans behind them while reciting protective chants. The nocturnal timing was considered essential to the ritual's power. Public spectacles also sometimes stretched into twilight, Amphitheatres occasionally hosted games that continued by lamplight. The glow of torches against stone arches created a striking, if imperfect, illumination. For audiences, these events blurred the boundary between day and night, extending entertainment beyond its natural limits. Darkness itself carried religious significance. Many temples closed at sunset, but some rites deliberately took place at night. Mystery cults, such as those devoted to Isis or Mithras, held ceremonies in dimly lit chambers, often timed to evoke secrecy and transformation. Household religion, too, sometimes called for nocturnal acts. Families might offer prayers to household gods before bed, asking for protection through the night. Dreams were regarded as messages from the divine, making sleep a sacred as well as physical experience. Astrologers and diviners often worked by night, reading stars or interpreting dreams for clients. Their activities linked the silence of darkness to the mysteries of fate, giving night a reputation as a time of hidden knowledge. Because nighttime carried risks, fire, theft, disorder, Roman authorities paid attention to its regulation. Laws forbade heavy carts from moving through city streets during daylight to avoid congestion, but permitted them at night. Thus, while ordinary citizens rested, wagons rumbled through the streets delivering supplies. Curfews were sometimes imposed in troubled times. During political unrest, the Senate might order restrictions on assemblies after dark. Emperors issued edicts concerning torchbearers, tavern hours, and the duties of watchmen. The very fact that such laws were needed suggests that nighttime activity was substantial. The vigiles, as noted before, formed the backbone of urban order at night. They patrolled in cohorts, carrying tools for firefighting and weapons for defense. Records describe them responding to disturbances, but also assisting with practical matters, such as guiding lost travelers. Their role reveals the blending of security and service in the Roman night. Not all Romans could end their labor at sunset. Bakers, as mentioned, worked overnight so that bread would be ready by morning. Millers often turned stones late into the evening, especially when powered by animals or water wheels that could operate continuously. Night was also the time for cleaning streets, removing waste, and repairing public spaces. Slaves and hired workers carried torches as they swept, collected refuse, or performed maintenance. The quieter hours provided opportunity to complete such tasks without obstructing daily traffic. For those employed in these nocturnal labors, sleep was delayed or fragmented. Rest might come in the morning or in short intervals. Their lives remind us that the Roman night was not simply a period of leisure or danger, but a working space for many. When we step back, the Roman night appears as a mosaic of overlapping activities. There were taverns alive with music, temples lit by oil lamps for secret rites, bakers kneading dough, watchmen patrolling alleys, and families resting under blankets. The empire's nights contained commerce, devotion, recreation, and risk in equal measure. For some, the night was opportunity, a chance to sell goods, to pray, to drink with friends. For others, it was threat, a time of thieves, fires, and shadows. The balance between these views shaped laws, customs, and personal habits. The Roman night reveals a society that did not simply retreat into sleep, but reorganized itself in creative ways. It reminds us that darkness is never just absence, but a stage for its own forms of life. And so we end this section with a quiet reflection. If the Roman night brought together laborers, worshippers, revelers, and rulers under the same darkness, how did these shared yet separate experiences shape their sense of community and difference? As we reach the final part of our journey into the Roman night, it is worth pausing to see how all the fragments fit together. Night was not an empty pause in Roman life, but rather a mirror that reflected the structures of society. The rich and the poor experienced darkness differently. For the wealthy, night could mean reclining at a banquet, enjoying lamps that burned costly imported oil, or participating in exclusive cult rites under vaulted ceilings. For the poor, night was more often about labor, about cautious steps through narrow alleys, or about brief respite in cramped housing. Yet both groups encountered the same cycles of fire risk, curfews, festivals, and the watchman's patrols. Roman ideas of sleep were pragmatic rather than medicalized in the modern sense. Sleep was understood as a natural necessity, but it was often interrupted. Dogs barked, carts rolled by delivering goods, taverns echoed with songs, and festivals stretched into the small hours. The city was seldom silent. The practice of segmented sleep, dozing, waking, and returning to rest was not unusual. Nights could be punctuated by prayers, small tasks, or even short walks. For those living in crowded households, silence was rare, and many adjusted to a rhythm of rest shaped more by circumstance than by ideal conditions. Philosophers occasionally reflected on sleep as a metaphor. To Stoics, night was a time to review the day's actions, preparing the mind for tomorrow. Epicureans emphasized tranquility, encouraging habits that would ease one into gentle rest. In this way, the Roman night was also a space for introspection. The simple oil lamp was the most common tool of the night, yet its importance was profound. Clay lamps, decorated with motifs ranging from dolphins to gladiators, were found in households across the empire. Their light enabled activity, extended social gatherings, and shaped the very possibility of nighttime life. Torches lit streets, while lanterns with glass or horn panes offered more controlled flames. Together, these tools formed the infrastructure of darkness. They were modest technologies, but they created continuity, linking day to night, enabling a seam of productivity and sociability that would otherwise have ended at dusk. When archaeologists uncover lamps in houses, taverns, or burial sites, they find evidence of how Romans structured their evenings. The objects may seem small, but their glow once shaped the routines of millions. Although Rome itself dominates many records, the experience of night varied across the empire. In frontier forts, soldiers kept watch under starlit skies, their rotations punctuated by horn signals. In provincial towns, local customs blended with Roman practices. In Egypt, night markets flourished near harbours, illuminated by rows of torches. In Britain, colder weather shortened evening gatherings but encouraged fireside drinking. In North Africa, festivals often included nocturnal processions with drums and chants. The empire's vastness ensured that night was never uniform. Yet the same institutions, watchmen, taverns, festivals, lamps, appeared in different forms across its territories, creating a sense of shared Roman order in the darkness. Night carried symbolic weight in Roman culture. Poets often used it as a backdrop for love affairs, secret meetings, or journeys. Historians describe conspiracies unfolding after sunset. Legal codes sometimes refer to crimes committed by night as particularly deceitful. At the same time, night could be a time of beauty. Writers described the cool air, the starry skies, the quiet roads outside the city. Rural nights offered peace unknown in urban quarters. The contrast between danger and serenity made night a flexible symbol, open to interpretation. Dreams, too, held symbolic importance. They were sometimes regarded as divine messages, sometimes as mere illusions. Temples of healing, such as those dedicated to Asclepius, invited supplicants to sleep within their walls, hoping for visions that would guide cures. Thus, night was not just absence of light, but a medium for communication between humans and the divine. As the empire entered later centuries, urban conditions changed. Fires, plagues, and invasions altered the texture of city life. Night remained a vulnerable time, but regulations continued. Christian communities developed their own nocturnal practices, gathering quietly in homes or catacombs for prayer. Eventually, vigils and night offices became part of monastic routines. Thus, Roman patterns of night both persisted and transformed. the tools, the risks, and the habits carried forward into medieval Europe, influencing how later societies structured their evenings. The balance between rest and activity, between sacred ritual and social pleasure, between risk and regulation, remained central. If we look back now, the Roman night seems surprisingly familiar. Street lighting, though limited, foreshadowed modern infrastructure. Night markets echo today's late shops and bazaars. Taverns resemble evening cafes or pubs. Watchmen anticipate modern police and fire brigades. Even the interruptions of urban noise feel close to contemporary city life. At the same time, there is a strangeness. The smoky glow of oil lamps, the barefoot rituals to appease spirits, the carts rumbling at midnight because daytime traffic was forbidden. These details remind us of a world at once connected to ours and distant in its textures. The Roman night was not a blank interval between days, but a living stage of its own. It contained work and worship, danger and delight, sleep and wakefulness. It asked people to adapt, to organize, and to imagine within its shifting shadows. And so we might close with a simple thought. When Romans looked up at the night sky, seeing the same stars we see today, did they think of themselves as part of a shared rhythm of human rest, or as unique participants in the peculiar order of their empire's nights? In much of medieval Europe, people did not expect to sleep in one long stretch. Instead, they often divided the night into two distinct periods of rest, separated by a quiet interval in the middle. This pattern is sometimes called segmented sleep or the two sleeps. The idea may feel unusual today, since we think of a normal night's sleep as continuous. But historical evidence, ranging from medical texts to personal letters, suggests that many households expected to wake up after a few hours of slumber. They would rise, tend to small tasks, perhaps pray, and then return to bed for a second sleep. This rhythm of night offered a structure that matched the conditions of pre-industrial life. With long winter nights, the division made use of the hours more flexibly. People lived by natural light, and sleep adapted accordingly. Clues to the two-sleep pattern appear in the words people used. Medieval texts refer to a first sleep and a second sleep. Writers treated these terms casually, as if their meaning was obvious. In English, French, Italian, and Latin sources alike, these phrases show up in passing. Characters in plays or chronicles might wake from a first sleep to speak, only to settle back down for a second. Physicians advised on how to use the waking interval for health. Religious guides suggested prayers suited to the midnight pause. The very ease with which these expressions appeared suggests that the pattern was ordinary, even unremarkable. It was not a curiosity to be explained, but a normal assumption about how the night was lived. What did people do during the gap between sleeps? Accounts vary, but a picture emerges of a calm, practical, and sometimes social time. Some used the interval for devotion. Monks rose for night offices, chanting psalms in darkened cloisters. Lay people might kneel in their homes, whispering prayers by candlelight. Manuals of piety recommended midnight as an especially powerful hour for reflection. Others turned to domestic tasks. The quiet provided a chance to check the fire, to mend tools, or to prepare food for the coming day. Some might step outside briefly to tend animals or relieve themselves. In rural areas, the stars and moon offered enough light to navigate familiar paths. Conversations also filled the interval. Couples might talk softly in bed, discussing household matters or exchanging intimacy. Neighbors sometimes visited one another, particularly in villages where doors were not firmly barred. The middle of the night could be unexpectedly social. The two sleeps fit the realities of medieval life. In winter, darkness lasted 12 to 14 hours in northern Europe, too long to spend entirely in bed. Dividing sleep allowed people to balance rest with wakeful tasks. Fires needed tending, animals required care, and households were often crowded. A midnight pause let people stretch, shift positions, or move about without disturbing others too much. For households that shared a single room, this rhythm made living together more manageable. Even in summer, when nights were shorter, the expectation of broken rest persisted. The habit became embedded in culture, shaping advice, prayer routines, and even medical recommendations. Physicians of the time often commented on the healthfulness of segmented sleep. Some advised that digestion was best served by rising after the first sleep, moving gently and then returning to bed. Others suggested that dreams occurring between sleeps were especially meaningful, since the body was lighter and more rested at that stage. Medical texts describe the body as governed by humours, and night was a period when these humours shifted. The waking interval provided a chance to rebalance through prayer, gentle exercise, or simply sitting in thought. Sleep was not just a physical act, but part of an ordered routine of health. Religion gave additional structure to the pattern. Christian monasticism built its schedules around the hours of the night. Monks rose for matins, or the midnight office, long before dawn. Lay people, influenced by these rhythms, sometimes imitated them in simpler ways, reciting prayers or psalms after their first sleep. The church encouraged nighttime devotion. Midnight was considered a liminal hour, when the boundary between earthly and divine seemed thinner. Hymns, sermons, and guides advise believers to use the wakeful interval for spiritual reflection. In this way, the habit of waking gained sacred meaning. Descriptions of daily life offer glimpses into this rhythm. A farmer might lie down soon after sunset, rise after several hours to stoke the fire, check the animals, and then return to bed. A city craftsman might use the interval to sharpen tools or record accounts by candlelight. A mother might feed an infant or soothe a child, then resettle the family. Literary sources mention lovers meeting in the night between sleeps. Courts sometimes recorded crimes committed during the interval, when people were up and moving about. The hours were quiet but not empty, filled with ordinary tasks and occasional disruptions. As we consider this forgotten rhythm, it is striking how normal it seemed to medieval people. Where we might regard waking at night as a problem, they often treated it as a resource. The interval was neither wasted time nor a symptom of disorder. It was simply part of life. The two sleeps remind us that human patterns of rest are flexible, shaped by culture, environment, and expectation. What feels natural to us may only be one arrangement among many. And so we pause at the end of this first section with a quiet thought. If medieval households lived by two sleeps, what might their nights reveal about how people once balanced work, worship, and rest within the long stretch of darkness? The two-sleep pattern is not reconstructed from a single text, but from a wide range of scattered references. Court records mention people rising from first sleep. Literary works describe characters waking in the night, then returning to bed. Medical treatises advise how best to use the interval. Sermons encourage prayers between sleeps. When pieced together, these fragments reveal a consistent assumption. Sleep was expected to come in two parts. For medieval households, the rhythm was so familiar that it scarcely required explanation. Although most evidence comes from Europe, segmented sleep was not limited to one region. In France, the term premier sommeil appears in household accounts. In Italy, primo sonno carried similar meaning. In England, references to first sleep appear in court cases, pastoral guides, and poems. Northern Europe, with its long winter nights, provided especially fertile ground for this habit. But southern regions also reflected the practice, suggesting that cultural expectations were as important as climate. The reach of the pattern across languages and geographies points to a widespread custom. Within the home, the two sleeps framed how families organized their nights. In rural cottages, households often retired soon after dusk. A first sleep lasted perhaps 4 hours, carrying them into the middle of the night. Then came a waking interval, sometimes lasting an hour or more, before the second sleep extended toward dawn. The waking time varied. Some households kept it short, using only enough minutes to tend fires or say prayers. Others stretched it into longer activity, socializing, working, or even visiting neighbors. Children grew up with this rhythm as normal. They learned that night was not only for rest, but also for pauses, quiet tasks, and conversations. Sleep was less an unbroken retreat and more a series of stages. Medical writers supported the practice by framing it as natural. The first sleep, they said, was heavy and restorative, helping the body process food and regain strength. The second sleep was lighter, more filled with dreams, and more suited to mental clarity. Some physicians recommended waking between sleeps to avoid indigestion or disturbed rest. Gentle movement, stretching, or prayer was considered beneficial. Others advised that this interval was the best time for marital intimacy, since the body was rested but not yet sluggish. Dreams were often discussed in relation to the second sleep. Writers believed that visions seen after midnight were clearer and more prophetic, because the soul was less weighed down by digestion. Manuals of dream interpretation often assumed this distinction. The church lent further authority to segmented sleep. Monastic orders rose for matins or vigils, sometimes in the deep of night. Their chanting of psalms set an example that lay people occasionally echoed at home. Guides to prayer recommended midnight devotion. Saints' lives describe holy figures rising after first sleep to pray. Preachers urged listeners to use the interval for reflection, framing wakefulness not as disturbance, but as opportunity. The pattern fit neatly into Christian symbolism. Night as a time of watchfulness, of preparation for salvation, of alertness against sin. By encouraging midnight prayer, the Church gave spiritual meaning to what was already a widespread habit. Not all activities were solemn. Court documents describe neighbors chatting during the interval, sometimes leading to disputes. Love poetry and tales often place secret meetings in the middle of the night, when households were awake but quiet. Work also took place. Bakers, as always, began their tasks in the early hours. Farmers might use the interval to check animals. Some households prepared dough, spun wool, or repaired tools. Small tasks that required firelight or quiet attention found a place in these hours. Even legal testimonies sometimes hinged on the rhythm. A witness might state that an event occurred after first sleep, using the phrase as a clear time marker. This shows how normal the pattern was in daily reckoning. Seasons shaped the practice. In winter, with nights stretching long, the interval could be extended comfortably. In summer, with shorter darkness, the two sleeps might be compressed, or the waking period shortened. Flexibility was part of the pattern's strength. People adapted the rhythm to their needs. The principle remained. Sleep was divided, with a pause in between, but the details shifted according to light and labor. By the early modern period, references to the two sleeps began to fade. Urban life grew more illuminated, with street lamps in some cities. Work hours lengthened, shaped by clocks rather than natural rhythms. Coffee and tea entered European diets, altering patterns of alertness. Gradually, a single consolidated sleep became the norm, especially in urban settings. Manuals of health stopped referring to first and second sleeps. By the 18th century, continuous rest was increasingly regarded as natural, while waking in the night was redefined as a problem. The older pattern did not vanish overnight, but it shifted from assumption to memory and finally to obscurity. To medieval people, segmented sleep was not strange or inconvenient. It was part of the order of life, balancing bodily needs with household tasks, spiritual practices, and social bonds. The waking interval was valued time, not wasted time. This perspective challenges modern assumptions. Today, sleeplessness often feels like disorder or illness. In medieval Europe, it was an expected rhythm. The contrast reminds us how cultural frames shape our experience of something as basic as rest. Looking at segmented sleep across languages, homes, medical texts, and sermons, we see a pattern that was once ordinary and later forgotten. The quiet interval between first and second sleeps carried meaning that blended the practical and the spiritual. And so, as we close this section, we may ask, if medieval people treated waking in the night as opportunity rather than problem, what might this suggest about how differently our own habits of rest could be understood? By the early modern centuries, the two-sleep pattern began to lose its hold. The change was gradual, not sudden. In many rural communities, segmented rest continued well into the 17th and even 18th centuries. But in towns and cities, the rhythm of night shifted. Several forces combined to encourage continuous sleep. Artificial lighting grew more common, especially with the spread of inexpensive oil lamps, and later, candles of higher quality. People stayed awake later, compressing the hours left for rest. Coffee and tea, imported from overseas, encouraged alertness into the evening. Clocks and watches also played their role. As time became more precisely measured, schedules tightened. Factories, workshops, and city services increasingly expected people to rise early and work longer. The room for a waking interval shrank. As practices shifted, so did medical theories. Physicians who once recommended the pause between sleeps began to write instead of the need for uninterrupted rest. By the 18th century, waking in the night was no longer a sign of balance, but of disorder. The language of first sleep and second sleep faded. Instead, health manuals described good sleep as deep, steady, and unbroken. Dreams were reinterpreted not as messages, but as byproducts of digestion or nervous agitation. Where once the body was thought to flourish by moving gently in the night, now it was urged to remain at rest. This medical redefinition helped reshape cultural expectations. Religion, too, adapted. Monastic communities retained their night offices, but among the laity, midnight prayers became less common. Parish life increasingly focused on daytime worship. Devotional guides emphasized morning and evening routines, leaving the middle of the night unremarked. The symbolism of wakefulness did not disappear, but it shifted toward metaphors of vigilance and spiritual readiness rather than literal midnight practice. The two sleeps, once interwoven with piety, slipped quietly from ordinary devotion. With the decline of segmented sleep came a new category of experience: insomnia. What had once been an expected waking interval became a source of anxiety. People who found themselves alert in the middle of the night worried that something was wrong. Doctors reinforced this concern, diagnosing broken sleep as illness. By the 19th century, entire industries offered cures for sleeplessness. From patent medicines to elaborate contraptions, the normal had been redefined as abnormal, and with it came new markets and anxieties. This reframing shows how cultural change transforms even bodily experience. The same pattern of wakefulness that once carried prayers and conversations was now treated as a symptom requiring remedy. Yet segmented sleep did not vanish entirely. In rural areas, particularly in parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, oral traditions remembered first and second sleeps into the 19th century. Folklore collectors noted phrases and habits that seemed to echo the older rhythm. Even in cities, some people continued to rise briefly in the night for small tasks. The difference was that these acts were no longer named or framed as part of a larger cultural pattern. They survived as individual habits rather than shared expectation. In the 20th century, historians began to notice the scattered references to first and second sleeps in old texts. Scholars such as A. Roger Ekirch gathered the evidence, showing how widespread and ordinary the practice had been. This rediscovery surprised many modern readers. The assumption that continuous sleep was natural turned out to be a cultural construction, only a few centuries old. Suddenly, the midnight wakefulness that troubled so many in the modern world appeared in a new light. Not necessarily an illness, but perhaps an echo of older rhythms. What might we take from this forgotten pattern? At one level, it is simply a reminder of human adaptability. Sleep is not fixed. It responds to environment, technology, and expectation. At another level, it challenges the modern sense that wakefulness at night must always be a problem. Some sleep researchers have suggested that people who wake in the night today may be reverting, in part, to segmented rhythms. Rather than treating this as disorder, one might see it as a natural variation with deep roots in history. The two sleeps also remind us of the role of culture in shaping even the most intimate parts of life. What feels instinctive is often learned. What feels timeless may be quite recent. Though the practice itself has faded, its memory lingers in literature, in old proverbs, and in the rhythms of communities that carried it longest. It stands as a quiet testament to how people once lived with darkness, making use of long nights not with frustration, but with calm adaptation. If modern life prizes efficiency and continuity, medieval life prized rhythm and balance, their nights contained both sleep and wakefulness, both rest and activity. It was not a mistake, but a way of living in tune with the turn of seasons and the length of nights. The medieval two sleeps remind us that history is full of forgotten customs that shape our sense of what is normal. When we lie awake at night, anxious about lost rest, we might recall that once, such waking was a natural, even expected part of life. And so we close this story with a simple question. If our ancestors lived by two sleeps without anxiety, what other daily rhythms, now taken as fixed, might also prove to be more fluid than we imagine? In the Ottoman Empire, dreams were not regarded merely as fleeting images of sleep. They were treated as meaningful signs, worthy of interpretation, recording, and careful use in decision-making. For rulers, soldiers, merchants, and ordinary believers alike, dreams could offer guidance. Dreams were catalogued in Tar-Burnam, dream manuals, that circulated widely in manuscript form. These texts listed images one might encounter in sleep and their possible meanings. To dream of water might suggest blessing. To see fire could warn of conflict. To encounter animals might reveal fortunes or dangers. Dreams were also shared aloud. Families recounted their dreams at breakfast. Neighbors exchanged them in courtyards. And individuals consulted interpreters who specialized in decoding symbols. The Ottoman world treated the subconscious not as private, but as a matter of shared curiosity and significance. Dream manuals occupied a peculiar niche in Ottoman culture. They were often modestly written, copied by hand and passed from one household to another. Many were based on earlier Islamic traditions, drawing on interpretations attributed to figures such as Ibn Sirin, a celebrated early authority on dreams. The manuals were arranged like dictionaries of symbols. A dreamer could look up an object or event, say, river or sword, and read what it might foretell. These texts blended folk wisdom, religious teaching, and practical advice. Copies varied in quality. Some were carefully bound and decorated. Others were rough notebooks filled with scrawled lists. Their wide distribution suggests that they reached across social classes, providing ordinary households with tools to understand their nightly visions. In Islamic teaching, dreams were classified into three kinds: those from God, those from the self, and those from the devil. The first kind was considered a form of revelation, offering comfort or warning. The second reflected one's daily concerns. The third were seen as temptations or confusions. Ottoman Muslims carried this framework into their daily lives. A dream thought to be divine might guide a decision, inspire a pilgrimage, or reassure someone in distress. A troubling dream might be dismissed as a whisper of the devil, best forgotten. Mosques sometimes hosted dream interpreters who offered guidance after prayers. Sufi communities placed particular emphasis on dreams, seeing them as pathways to spiritual insight. In this setting, the manuals and oral traditions worked hand in hand with religious practice. The role of dreams was not confined to scholars or saints. An artisan might dream of coins and take it as a sign of upcoming profit. A mother might dream of her child in peril and respond with protective prayers. A soldier might dream of victory before a campaign and share it proudly with his comrades. In villages, elders often acted as informal interpreters. Their readings blended tradition with local wisdom, shaping how communities responded to their dreams. Such interpretations could influence decisions as small as when to plant crops, or as large as whether to undertake a journey. Even in the palace, dreams held weight. Chronicles describe sultans recounting dreams before battles or campaigns. Court historians recorded these visions, often presenting them as divine approval of the ruler's path. A sultan dreaming of conquest, for example, might see it as confirmation of legitimacy. Advisors and scholars would interpret the imagery, sometimes aligning it with Quranic verses or prophetic traditions. These accounts were not only private, but political, shaping narratives of power. In this way, dreams crossed the boundary between personal experience and public meaning. They linked the intimate world of sleep with the machinery of empire. From village households to the imperial court, dreams were woven into Ottoman life. They were spoken, written, consulted, and treasured. Manuals of interpretation gave structure to what might otherwise seem fleeting. To modern readers, the idea of treating dreams as a form of administration, as something to be guided, ordered, and explained, may seem curious. Yet in the Ottoman context, it was part of the fabric of daily life. And so we end this first section with a quiet thought. If dreams were once treated as guides for decisions both personal and political, what might this reveal about how people blurred the line between waking and sleeping worlds? When we look at the Tabe name, Ottoman dream manuals, we find a surprisingly orderly structure. Most were arranged alphabetically by keyword, much like a dictionary. One might flip to the entry for apple, or river, or dog, and find a short statement of what such a dream meant. Some manuals were quite concise, listing only a symbol and a phrase of interpretation. Others were expansive, offering several possible readings for each image, often supported by references to earlier authorities. A dream of the moon, for example, might be explained as signifying a ruler, a mother, or knowledge, depending on the context. The tone of these manuals was calm and practical. They were not intended as entertainment, but as guides, tools for managing life's uncertainties by decoding the signs of sleep. Certain images appeared again and again. Animals were frequent dream figures. A lion might represent strength, authority, or a tyrant. A snake could indicate hidden enemies or, in some cases, healing and wisdom. Birds often signified the soul or travel. Objects of daily life filled the pages as well. Keys, doors, clothing, and bread all carried symbolic weight. To dream of bread was commonly taken as a sign of sustenance and blessing. To see a door could mean opportunity or closure, depending on its condition. Natural features were especially prominent. Rivers, mountains, gardens, and stars all appeared with layered meanings. These symbols connected dreamers to both the physical and spiritual worlds. The manuals did not invent these meanings from nothing. They drew on a long tradition of Islamic dream interpretation, particularly the works attributed to Ibn Sirin. Though the historical Ibn Sirin lived in the 8th century, many texts circulated under his name in later centuries, shaping the field across the Islamic world. Ottoman authors adapted these traditions to their own context. They incorporated local idioms, regional customs, and specific concerns of Ottoman society. Thus, while sharing a broader heritage, the dream manuals carried distinctive Ottoman flavors. Dream manuals were not restricted to scholars. Manuscript copies appear in private collections, suggesting household use. Some were small enough to be carried on journeys, while others were copied into notebooks alongside recipes, prayers, and household accounts. Merchants might consult them before embarking on a trade venture. Farmers might turn to them during uncertain seasons. Women in households recorded dreams of children, marriages, and illnesses, seeking guidance in times of concern. The accessibility of these texts indicates their broad audience. They served as everyday companions, much like almanacs or collections of proverbs. Alongside written manuals, professional interpreters operated in many towns. These specialists were often associated with religious schools, mosques, or Sufi lodges. They listened carefully to dream accounts and drew upon both memory and text to offer explanations. Their role was both advisory and social. A good interpreter provided not only meanings but also reassurance. By placing a troubling dream into a familiar framework, they reduced anxiety and offered a sense of order. Sometimes interpreters became renowned figures, consulted by officials or rulers. At other times, they remained humble neighborhood guides, offering their insights in exchange for small gifts. The spread of dream manuals relied on the thriving culture of manuscript copying in the Ottoman Empire. Scribes copied texts for payment, but families also made their own copies for private use. Margins often contain notes where owners added personal observations or new interpretations. In larger cities like Istanbul, Bursa, and Cairo, manuscript markets included dream manuals among their wares. Booksellers knew there was steady demand for these texts. Their portability and practical use helped ensure their popularity. Even after the rise of printing in the empire during the 18th and 19th centuries, dream manuals continued to circulate in handwritten form, blending old habits with new technologies. Dream interpretation was not uniform across the empire. Manuals produced in Anatolia, the Balkans, or Arab provinces sometimes emphasized different symbols. A dream of olive trees, for example, might be more elaborately described in a Syrian or Palestinian manual than in one from Rumelia. These variations reveal how local landscapes and livelihoods shaped symbolic language. A fisherman in coastal towns might dream of the sea and seek its meanings, while a shepherd in mountain regions might focus on dreams of flocks and pastures. Yet despite these differences, a shared core of symbols connected the manuals across vast distances, tying together the empire's diverse populations through a common dream language. For Ottoman readers, the manuals were not merely fortune-telling devices. They reflected a worldview in which the spiritual and the practical were inseparable. A dream of rain could suggest divine mercy, but it might also be taken as a practical reassurance for crops. This blending is perhaps what gave the manuals their enduring appeal. They address both the anxieties of daily life and the larger concerns of the soul. They reassured the dreamer that ordinary images carried hidden order, that the unpredictable world of sleep could be given shape. Dream manuals show us not only what people believed about dreams, but also how they sought to manage uncertainty. In a time before modern psychology, the interpretation of sleep provided a framework for navigating doubt, anxiety, and hope. The manuals were small instruments of stability, offering calm answers to nightly questions. They linked private visions with shared traditions, making the personal dream part of a larger cultural fabric. And so we leave this second section with a thought. If the Ottomans could use dream books as practical guides for daily choices, how might this challenge our own distinction between imagination and reality? By the late 18th and 19th centuries, Ottoman dream manuals began to decline in prominence. Several factors contributed to this shift. Literacy was spreading in new ways, and printed books began to replace handwritten manuscripts. Education systems emphasized religious texts and practical manuals over personal guides to dreams. At the same time, social and economic changes altered daily life. Urbanization, expanded commerce, and new administrative demands meant that practical decision-making relied more on records, calculations, and official advice than on nocturnal visions. Dreams, once woven into routine life, increasingly became a private, personal matter. Despite these shifts, dream manuals did not vanish entirely. In villages and smaller towns, handwritten copies continued to circulate. Families preserved them alongside household accounts, herbal remedies, and prayer books. In folk memory, dreams retained significance. Stories of predictive dreams or warnings from the subconscious persisted in oral culture. Elders passed on advice learned from manuscripts, and local interpreters continued to provide guidance in a way that bridged traditional belief and practical need. The manual's decline was not total disappearance, but a fading of institutional support. Their authority shifted from broad circulation to localized private practice. Some Ottoman dream manuals were copied and collected in libraries across the former empire. Scholars in Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East preserved manuscripts that date back centuries, keeping alive a record of how dreams were organized, codified, and interpreted. Interest in these texts has revived in recent decades. Historians, anthropologists, and cultural scholars study them not as curiosities, but as windows into Ottoman thought and daily life. They reveal how a society managed uncertainty, interpreted signs, and incorporated the subconscious into practical and spiritual life. The Ottoman approach to dreams suggests a different relationship with the subconscious than modern societies often allow. Rather than dismissing dreams as irrelevant or purely psychological, Ottoman readers treated them as meaningful tools. This attitude offered reassurance, structure, and reflection. In interpreting dreams, people engaged in calm contemplation, consulting texts, experts, and community knowledge. Their nights were not chaotic. They were guided by subtle frameworks that connected private experience to public and spiritual concerns. Dreams also served a social function, sharing visions at home, consulting interpreters, or recounting sultans' dreams in court, linked individual experiences to community life. They created a network of interpretation that extended from household to empire. This social dimension is often overlooked in modern readings of Ottoman culture. Dreams were not just personal, they were part of an organized system for understanding the world. The manuals were instruments of administration, not bureaucratic in the modern sense, but guiding thought, behavior, and communal understanding. The rise of modern science and changing religious practices gradually reduced the formal authority of dream manuals. With the advent of psychology, people were encouraged to view dreams as private mental phenomena rather than public guides to action. Yet the manual's influence lingered in subtle ways. Popular literature, folk stories, and oral traditions retained elements of dream symbolism. Even today, many communities across the former Ottoman lands continue to speak of dreams in ways that echo these older manuals. Dream manuals remind us that historical practices often operate at multiple levels. Private, communal, spiritual, and practical, they offer a model of how societies can integrate the unpredictable world of sleep into the rhythms of daily life. In the Ottoman Empire, dreams were neither chaotic nor ignored. They were catalogued, interpreted, shared, and applied. In doing so, they became a quiet instrument for navigating uncertainty, a bridge between imagination and action, subconscious and social order. As we consider the Ottoman dream manuals, it becomes clear that what we may regard as private, fleeting, or unimportant dreams was once treated with careful attention and respect. They guided choices, comforted anxieties, and linked the individual to broader communities and spiritual traditions. And so, we end this story with a gentle question. If the Ottomans could treat dreams as instruments for understanding life, what might we learn from their example about paying attention to our own subconscious rhythms today? The Industrial Revolution transformed not only work but also the very experience of night. Before factories, towns and villages largely aligned daily activity with sunlight. Even in cities, streets were dark after sunset and most labor ceased until morning. But as mechanized industry spread, night began to take on a new role. Factories demanded continuous production, and the invention of safe, bright lighting enabled labor after dark. Gas lamps, and later electric lights, illuminated interiors that would otherwise have been confined to shadows. For the first time, humans could operate machinery around the clock, compressing work and production cycles in ways previously unimaginable. Textile mills, ironworks, and other industrial enterprises increasingly required shifts that extended into the night. Workers were rotated to maintain machinery, meet production targets, and maximize profits. The concept of the night shift was born, formally structuring hours in a way that had few historical precedents. Night work introduced new rhythms for laborers. Sleep schedules were altered, family life rearranged, and routines once governed by sunlight now became flexible and artificial. Streets outside factories remained quiet, while interiors hummed with activity, machines clattering under gaslight. The expansion of night work depended on lighting technologies. Early factories relied on coal gas lamps, which provided a steady but sometimes smoky illumination. Candles supplemented light in smaller workshops, while oil lamps were common for home-based or cottage industry. The quality of lighting affected both productivity and safety. Poor illumination increased accidents, while brighter lamps enabled more precise work and longer hours. Industrial engineers began to design interior layouts with the goal of maximizing light coverage and minimizing shadows that could hide hazards. Street lighting also transformed cities. Gas lamps appeared along urban roads, extending commercial activity and permitting safer passage for workers traveling to and from night shifts. Night became a managed environment, shaped by technology as much as by human routine. For laborers, the night shift was both opportunity and challenge. Wages were sometimes higher for night work, offering financial incentive, yet disrupted sleep and long hours posed health risks. People adapted in different ways. Some slept in two segments, echoing older patterns of rest. Others relied on brief naps during the day to supplement nighttime labor. Communities of night workers formed their own rhythms. Meals were timed differently, social activities shifted, and family life adjusted to accommodate absence during conventional evening hours. Industrial towns created neighborhoods with distinctive routines, reflecting the presence of nocturnal labor. Night labor was not only a male domain. Women worked in textile mills, food processing, and other industries that required around-the-clock operation. Their experience of night was shaped by multiple responsibilities: managing household duties, caring for children, and attending to work outside the home. In some sectors, children were also employed, their hours extending into evening shifts. This combination of gendered and generational labor illustrates how the industrial night was socially layered, affecting different groups in unique ways. Governments and reformers soon noticed the strains of night work. Laws were enacted to limit hours, especially for women and children. Early 19th century Britain introduced regulations on factory operation, addressing both the dangers of darkness and the demands of round-the-clock labor. Health concerns included exhaustion, accidents, and the effects of disrupted circadian rhythms. Critics argued that night work undermined family life and moral stability, while factory owners emphasized economic necessity. The debate reveals a tension between efficiency, profit, and human well-being, a negotiation that shaped industrial society. Evenings outside factories began to develop their own character. Workers gathered in taverns, tea houses, and small markets, creating social spaces attuned to the hours they kept. Music, conversation, and late-night meals provided relief and camaraderie. Urban infrastructure responded to this new nocturnal population. Street vendors, bakeries, and transport systems adapted to the presence of night laborers. Night shifted from being merely a pause to becoming a lived, structured time with its own commerce, leisure, and social networks. Writers and observers of the time commented on the transformation. Night was no longer a quiet, contemplative period, but a bustling extension of industrial life. Literary accounts describe the eerie glow of gas lamps, the constant hum of machines, and the unsettling yet fascinating energy of cities awake after dark. Artists and photographers captured the contrast of light and shadow, documenting the ways industrialization altered perception. Night became a space not only of labor, but of modern imagination, a setting for both fascination and concern. The industrial night reminds us that darkness is not fixed in human experience. With technology, social organization, and economic necessity, people redefine night as a time for production and social activity. The shadows were no longer simply empty. They became filled with labor, light, and new rhythms of life. And so we close this first section with a quiet reflection. If industrialization could transform night into a time of work and social life, how did these changes alter our relationship to rest, family, and the natural rhythm of day and night? Night labor required people to develop new rhythms. Workers often split their sleep, napping in the afternoon to compensate for late night hours. Some maintained older cultural practices, like short pauses during the night, to balance fatigue. These adaptations were informal, learned within households and neighborhoods. Communities of night workers also created social routines. Taverns, coffee houses, and bakeries adjusted hours to serve the nocturnal population. Informal social networks developed among colleagues who shared similar schedules, offering companionship and practical support during long nights. Women played key roles in the industrial night economy. In textile mills and food processing, they often worked evening or overnight shifts while simultaneously managing household tasks. This dual responsibility shaped their routines and required careful organization of sleep, meals, and childcare. Children were also involved, particularly in early industrial contexts. Legal regulations gradually limited child labor at night, but in many regions, families depended on the additional income. These patterns highlight the social and generational dimensions of night work, showing how industrial labor reshaped household life. Physicians and reformers raised concerns about the effects of night labor on health. Reports emphasized fatigue, disrupted digestion, and exposure to accidents caused by poor lighting. Chronic exhaustion became common, and industrial doctors began studying the consequences of round-the-clock work. Workers themselves developed informal coping strategies. Some carried portable lamps, adjusted diets to sustain energy, or organized brief rest periods during shifts. Yet despite these efforts, night labor remained taxing, emphasizing the human limits in adapting to artificially extended working hours. Lighting technologies were central to night work. Gas lamps illuminated factories and streets, while electric lights introduced toward the late 19th century increased safety and productivity. Engineers designed factory interiors to maximize illumination, reducing shadowed corners where accidents were more likely. In urban areas, street lighting also changed movement patterns. Workers could travel more safely at night, creating corridors of human activity that extended well beyond factory walls. Towns and cities slowly reconfigured themselves to accommodate the presence of night laborers. Governments and reformers began to intervene as the social and health impacts of night work became evident. Early legislation in Britain, for instance, limited the hours women and children could work overnight. Inspectors monitored factories, and newspapers reported accidents linked to fatigue and poor lighting. Reformers argued for both practical and moral reasons. Night work, they contended, endangered bodies, disrupted families, and undermined social cohesion. Factory owners, however, emphasized economic necessity, citing continuous production as essential to competing in industrial markets. The rise of night labor transformed cities in ways that went beyond factory interiors. Streets became lit, and commercial activity extended into the evening hours. Markets, food stalls, and small businesses adapted to the presence of night workers, creating new patterns of social interaction and commerce. The urban night developed its own character. Noise from machinery and transport blended with social chatter and the movement of workers. The city was no longer dormant after dusk, but vibrant in a structured industrial rhythm. Observers of the period commented on the strange energy of night cities. Writers, journalists, and artists documented glowing factory interiors, busy streets, and the unusual juxtaposition of human activity against darkness. These descriptions capture both fascination and unease. Night was no longer quiet or contemplative. It was a space of production, opportunity, and social innovation. Industrial nightlife reshaped perceptions of urban time, revealing how human organization could transform natural cycles. Night labor allowed factories to maximize output and profits, making it an essential component of industrial economics. Shift systems ensured machinery operated continuously, minimizing downtime and increasing efficiency. For workers, this meant both opportunity and exploitation. While wages could be higher for night shifts, the physical and social costs were significant. Families, communities, and health were all affected by the new temporal demands of industrial production. The industrial night illustrates how technology, social organization, and labor needs can redefine time itself. Darkness, once a natural boundary for work, became a space of activity, commerce, and social connection. Human life adapted, sometimes creatively, sometimes at great cost. And so we leave this section with a reflection. If factories and urban lighting transformed night into a productive and social space, how did these changes alter the very meaning of rest, family life, and human rhythm in industrial societies? The industrial night imposed new pressures on workers. Chronic fatigue, disrupted digestion, and accidents became widespread. Physicians documented the toll, linking night shifts to both physical and mental strain. Workers adopted informal coping strategies. Some napped during the day, others staggered sleep in shorter segments. Communities developed social supports to sustain those working nocturnal hours. Yet the limitations of the human body remained, reminding employers and reformers alike that night labor could not be entirely without cost. Night work reshaped family life. Parents on night shifts had to coordinate childcare differently, and mealtimes shifted to accommodate rotating schedules. Social routines adapted, with taverns, bakeries, and transport networks operating at hours aligned with industrial rhythms. Neighborhoods evolved. Areas surrounding factories became distinct nocturnal zones, where streets, businesses, and homes reflected the presence of night laborers. A new social geography emerged, tied to illuminated streets and humming machines. Writers, journalists, and artists documented the transformed night. The glow of gas and electric lamps, the constant hum of machinery, and the movement of human bodies created an unfamiliar modern aesthetic. Night was no longer passive or reflective. It was active, productive, and social. These observations influenced literature, photography, and social commentary. Night shifted from a symbol of mystery or rest to a marker of industrial modernity. Cultural understanding of darkness adapted alongside physical and economic change. Governments increasingly regulated night labor. Child labor laws, limits on women's hours, and safety standards for factories reflected awareness of the human costs. Reforms balanced economic needs with social welfare, aiming to reduce harm while sustaining industrial output. The dialogue between productivity and human limits became a recurring theme. Night work demonstrated both the capacity of human society to reorganize natural cycles and the persistent challenges of managing health, safety, and social cohesion. Lighting remained central. Gas lamps evolved into electricity, enabling safer and more extensive nocturnal work. Transportation systems, including trams and early trains, adapted to move workers efficiently. Night became technologically mediated, with human adaptation intertwined with machines and infrastructure. This period laid the foundation for modern 24-hour societies. Urban life, industrial production, and social activity began to extend across hours previously reserved for rest, creating patterns that persist in contemporary cities. The industrial night shifted expectations about sleep, labor, and social rhythm. What had once been a natural pause became optional, extended by technology and economic demand. Families, workers, and urban planners had to navigate new temporal landscapes. Modern society still bears these legacies. Shift work, late-night commerce, and illuminated cities are products of the innovations and disruptions of the industrial night. While technology allows flexibility, it also raises ongoing questions about health, rest, and social well-being. The story of night labor demonstrates human resilience and ingenuity. People adapted routines, developed social networks, and integrated technology to thrive in extended work hours. At the same time, it highlights the limits of endurance and the importance of balance. Night, once a natural boundary, became a managed environment, a place where human organization, technology, and social life intersected. The industrial transformation of darkness reminds us that even the most basic patterns of human life can be reshaped by society, economy, and invention. The industrial night teaches a quiet lesson about change. Patterns once taken for granted, sleep, rest, family routines, can be transformed by technology and labor demands. Societies adapt, but adaptation comes with costs and requires negotiation between human needs and systemic pressures. And so we end this story with a reflective question. If night could be transformed into a space of work, sociality, and commerce, what does this suggest about the ways humans can reshape their natural rhythms, and what we may still learn from the balance of darkness and rest? In Qing Dynasty China, sleep was not solely a private, personal activity. The state, local officials, and social norms treated rest as something to be observed, regulated, and occasionally enforced. The timing, location, and duration of sleep could become matters of legal or moral concern. While this may seem unusual today, it reflected a broader philosophy. Social order was mirrored in the rhythms of individual life. Rest, like labor, ritual, and education, was a thread in the fabric of harmony. In the eyes of the authorities, erratic or unauthorized sleep could threaten not only health but also discipline, productivity, and social hierarchy. The Qing dynasty, 1644-1912, governed a vast and diverse empire with complex administrative structures. Officials sought order across towns, villages, and urban centers. Policies extended from taxation and trade to daily behavior, including sleep. Medical texts of the period recommended specific sleep schedules, often emphasizing early nights and early rising. Confucian moral thought reinforced these ideas. Disciplined sleep reflected virtue, responsibility, and alignment with the natural order. Waking late, or sleeping excessively, could be interpreted as moral laxity or a sign of disorder. Reports from magistrates and officials indicate that authorities sometimes intervened in sleeping habits. In certain towns, curfews regulated the hours when streets should be empty, indirectly shaping when people went to bed. Neighborhood elders monitored households, and public admonishments could occur if rest patterns appeared disruptive or negligent. Some forms of public punishment for irregular sleep were subtle. Official warnings, fines, or public shaming were used sparingly but strategically. The message was clear. Sleep was not entirely private, and individual habits could reflect on social and familial honor. Within homes, sleep reflected hierarchy and social duty. Heads of households often rose earliest, setting an example for family members. Children, servants, and laborers had schedules aligned with domestic work, agricultural demands, or scholarly study. Beds and sleeping arrangements reinforced social order. Family quarters were organized so that elders occupied prime positions, while younger members or servants adapted to available spaces. Quiet, orderly sleep was considered part of moral cultivation. Traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, linked sleep patterns to health and longevity. Texts emphasized the connection between circadian rhythms, organ function, and the flow of qi, vital energy. Late or irregular sleep was thought to disturb balance, weaken immunity, and reduce productivity. Philosophical thought, particularly Confucian ethics, framed sleep as a moral habit. Self-discipline was expressed through punctual rest and wakefulness. Sleep aligned with the cycles of day and night, reflecting harmony with the cosmos and social order. In cities such as Beijing, Suzhou, and Guangzhou, magistrates' reports mention vigilance over night activity. Late-night gatherings, prolonged leisure, or unattended street activity could draw attention. Sleep, in this context, became a communal matter. Who slept when and where mattered to neighbors and officials alike. The observation extended to inns and guest houses, where authorities ensured that travelers adhered to curfews. Regulations were sometimes written, sometimes enforced through custom and local authority. Sleep was both private and socially accountable. Despite regulation, nighttime activity persisted. Merchants, artisans, and laborers often worked into the evening, especially during harvests or festivals. Sleep schedules were therefore negotiated. Ordinary rules coexisted with practical necessity. Officials recognized this flexibility, but interventions were applied when deviations seemed excessive or morally threatening. Public messages encouraged balance, work and rest in proper order, reflecting the broader Confucian vision of societal harmony. The Qing approach reminds us that sleep has not always been understood solely as a personal or biological matter. Across the empire, rest intersected with law, morality, and social expectations. Individuals were guided, nudged, or even disciplined to maintain rhythms considered essential to collective well-being. And so we end this first section with a thought. If sleep was once regulated as part of moral and civic life, what might this reveal about the way society can shape the most intimate aspects of daily existence? Qing authorities codified expectations about sleep in both formal regulations and customary practice. While not every region had written rules specifically targeting rest, curfews and public order laws indirectly structured sleep. Streets and marketplaces were expected to be quiet after certain hours, and public officials often monitored adherence. Magistrates could issue warnings for late-night noise or disruptive gatherings, emphasizing that rest and order were civic responsibilities. Sleep, in this sense, became both a private necessity and a public concern, with legal and moral dimensions intertwined. In urban centers, curfews were enforced to maintain order. Citizens were expected to remain at home, and nighttime patrols ensured compliance. Merchants closing shops, travelers returning to inns, and households attending to evening meals all operated under these rhythms. Breaking curfew could result in fines or public admonishment. The enforcement of curfews was not merely punitive, it aimed to harmonize daily life, ensuring that families could rest without disruption, and that cities retained a sense of calm and predictability after dark. Beyond formal regulations, moral norms governed sleep. Confucian principles emphasized discipline, moderation, and alignment with natural cycles. Excessive sleeping, especially during productive hours, could be criticized as laziness or moral failing. Conversely, insufficient rest was also cautioned against, particularly in medical and philosophical texts. Sleep was to be balanced, enough to preserve health, but not so much as to neglect duty or social responsibility. These dual pressures framed rest as an ethical as well as practical habit. Within families, sleep patterns were reinforced by hierarchy. Elders and heads of households set schedules, and younger members were expected to comply. Servants or laborers also followed the household rhythm, aligning personal rest with domestic needs. In some accounts, parents or masters disciplined children and subordinates for irregular sleep, rising too late, staying awake excessively, or neglecting morning duties. Through repetition and observation, households instilled habits deemed socially and morally appropriate. Agricultural and craft schedules intersected with sleep regulations. Farmers needed to rise early to tend fields. Artisans followed shop hours tied to market demand. Nighttime rest was a structured part of productivity, and deviations could affect both household and community outcomes. Workers learned to navigate this framework carefully. They balanced rest with labor, social obligations, and local enforcement expectations. Sleep became a skill, managed to align with multiple pressures from family, economy, and state authority. Historical records mention subtle forms of punishment for irregular sleep patterns. Officials sometimes issued fines for curfew violations. In rare cases, public shaming reinforced compliance, highlighting that failure to adhere to expected sleep and rest rhythms could damage reputation. These measures were designed less to punish individuals harshly than to maintain social order. Sleep was intertwined with civic duty. The enforcement of rest reflected a belief that disciplined habits supported the stability of the community. Travelers to Qing cities often noted the attention paid to rest and curfew. European observers recorded that streets emptied at night, and inns enforced early bedtimes for guests. These accounts emphasize the degree to which sleep was integrated into social control, not merely a private matter. Scholars studying Chinese governance highlighted the connection between sleep regulation, public order, and Confucian ideals. Sleep became a lens through which to view broader societal priorities, discipline, hierarchy, and the alignment of individual behavior with communal well-being. Despite regulations and moral expectations, people adapted creatively. Nighttime activity persisted for essential work, travel, or study. Families sometimes staggered sleep within households, allowing some members to fulfill obligations while others rested. Merchants and artisans who needed to work in evening hours developed schedules that balanced practical needs with enforcement expectations. These adaptations reveal the flexibility and negotiation inherent in daily life, showing that regulation and lived experience did not always align perfectly. Traditional Chinese medicine reinforced state and household guidance on sleep. Manuals emphasized early rising, moderate duration, and alignment with seasonal cycles. Sleep was viewed as restorative, connected to organ function, vitality, and mental clarity. Confucian and medical thought converged to create an integrated framework. Moral, legal, and bodily health were all considered when regulating sleep. Ordinary people internalized these ideas, blending state guidance, family oversight, and personal experience. The Qing approach to sleep demonstrates that even the most private human activities can be shaped by legal, moral, and social expectations. Rest was not simply biological, it was a carefully managed part of public and household life, reflecting broader ideals of harmony and order. And so we leave this section with a reflection. If sleep could be monitored, regulated, and morally evaluated, what does this suggest about the ways societies can shape, even govern, the intimate rhythms of daily life? The regulation of sleep in Qing China shaped the rhythms of daily life in subtle but pervasive ways. Households organized work, meals, and study around expected rest periods. Children learned discipline through adherence to schedules. Adults aligned agricultural, commercial, or bureaucratic labor with curfews and societal expectations. Sleep became a visible measure of virtue and responsibility. Rising early, going to bed on time, and maintaining orderly household routines were both practical and moral acts. Deviations could reflect poorly on one's family, affecting social standing and reputation. Despite regulations, people adapted creatively. Families staggered sleep to accommodate domestic work or night obligations. Merchants, artisans, and travelers sometimes negotiated their own schedules within legal and moral frameworks. In rural areas, enforcement was more flexible, allowing seasonal or agricultural adjustments. In cities, some residents found ways to discreetly extend their activity hours while technically adhering to curfews. These adaptations illustrate the tension between official expectation and lived experience. By the late Qing period, formal enforcement of sleep regulations gradually waned. Urbanization, modernization, and changes in administrative priorities shifted focus toward policing trade, sanitation, and public safety, rather than intimate daily habits. Medical and philosophical advice continued to encourage regular sleep, but moralized enforcement became less prominent. Households and communities retained guidance practices, but the state's direct role in regulating sleep receded. The cultural legacy of Qing sleep regulation is subtle but persistent. Traditional emphasis on early rising, balanced rest, and alignment with natural cycles survived in folk practice, household routines, and moral teaching. Even today, echoes of these rhythms can be seen in cultural attitudes toward punctuality, disciplined daily routines, and the integration of work, study, and rest. Sleep is understood not only as a personal habit, but as part of social and ethical life, a continuity of Qing-era thinking. Qing sleep laws illustrate that rest can serve as more than biological necessity. Sleep became a tool for maintaining order, teaching discipline, and reinforcing social hierarchy. By aligning private rhythms with communal expectations, society shaped intimate behavior for perceived collective benefit. This perspective invites reflection on how societies negotiate control over private life and how moral, legal, and social frameworks influence even the quietest human acts. The Qing example demonstrates that governing a population extends beyond economics, politics, and security. Social order can be fostered through the regulation of seemingly personal routines. Sleep regulation reveals a broader principle. Human daily life is interwoven with cultural, moral, and political frameworks. What seems personal, when to sleep, how long to rest, is shaped by collective ideas about order, health, and virtue. As we conclude this story, we are reminded that the rhythms of life, sleep, work, and leisure are never entirely private. They are subject to cultural negotiation, moral guidance, and sometimes state oversight. And so we leave this reflection with a gentle question. If societies can shape the intimate patterns of rest, what other private rhythms of our lives are quietly guided by culture, law, or expectation?